Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 4. In week 4, we're going to look at the psychological barriers that often get in the way of the analysis of intelligence. So remember that analysts often operate in a place that is just overwhelmed with ambiguity and unsureness. And in addition to all of that, there's a lot of psychological factors and barriers that can interfere with the successful analysis and evaluation and application of intelligence. And we're going to go through those. So the first one is confirmation bias, which is a huge problem to the analysis of information and intelligence. And this is the tendency to interpret new information as confirming your already existing beliefs. This often leads to tunnel vision. In short, this is when you think you know the answer, so all the information that comes across your desk, you will find a way to get it to support your answer, or you will perceive it as supporting your answer. And any information that comes your way that doesn't will just sort of get psychologically ignored, right? And that other information might be of incredible importance. Mirror imaging is a problem, and that's the concept that everybody thinks like we do here in the United States. But remember, a lot of the intelligence that we're doing is about foreign governments and foreign countries that have completely and totally different cultural perspectives, practices, etc., than we do. So we can't necessarily assume that their patterns of behavior mean the same thing in their culture as they do in our culture. We have to be culturally contextually aware of what things mean in their culture versus how they mean something different in our culture, so we don't misinterpret that information. There's something called fundamental attribution error, and this is the tendency to attribute the behaviors of other people to their personalities while undervaluing the situational factors for their actions. So a very basic example of fundamental attribution error would be when somebody loses their job and you say, well, of course they did. They're a lazy person. They have a lazy personality. Without looking at the greater picture and saying, yeah, but the company is not doing well. They can't support all of these workers. Maybe it didn't have anything to do with their laziness or their personality. Maybe the company just literally couldn't afford to keep these workers, or that position became obsolete. We saw fundamental attribution error in interpretation of intelligence and analysis of intelligence regarding Saddam Hussein and the use of WMDs. And the perspective was, well, he's a sociopath. He must have weapons of mass destruction. But all of the intelligence that was coming in was saying, we can't find any, and we can't find any proof or any trail that there may be any WMDs in the borders of Iraq. But because everyone was, well, he's such a bad guy and he would totally do something like this, they got that tunnel vision and they assumed he must have them. And ultimately, it was found out he did not. There's the recency effect, and this is when humans are biased to recall information that is most recently learned, and therefore you rely on it more heavily than other information that maybe you were exposed to a few weeks or a few months back. That leads again to more tunnel vision. Or the analyst misinterprets the intelligence and fails to communicate important elements of information. This is very similar to availability bias, which is the tendency to attach relevancy to the information that's most easily retrieved versus information that's harder to get at, right? That we are more likely to, sort of cherry pick what is just easier around us. Cause and effect is an issue. The analyst may fall into overgeneralization on what causes something. So, for example, the idea of, well, what causes terrorism? Does poverty cause terrorism? Well, in some respects, it may very well cause terrorism, but if that becomes our only cause and effect narrative, we will continue to default to that and ignore all the other potential root causes. Correlation. This is often a fallacy that I nail home with my statistics and research methods students. Correlation means that two things are related. It means that when one increases, the other increases. When one decreases, the other decreases, or it can be inversely related, that when one increases, the other decreases. But remember that this is a relationship. Correlation does not equal causation, right? So just because two things change either in the same direction or in different directions at the same time, it does not mean that one causes the other. And if that is the idea that you're operating under, you're going to have misguided intelligence. The fallacy of big results and big cause is the misbelief that big causes are always have to have big results. So, for example, in the Cold War, it was believed that the only way that the Cold War could be ended was through the use of nuclear weapons, that one side had to destroy the other in order for the ending to come about. Ultimately, thankfully, that's not what happened. The Soviet Union fell due to economic instability, and along with it, so too fell the Cold War. The fallacy of centralized direction is when analysts assume that there's a shared a shared goal of a group, and that the actions of every member of that group must be driven by that goal. That's a mouthful. So let me give you an example. Let's say there's a terrorist group that doesn't like a certain religious sect, so they bomb a church. You automatically assume, well, it must be because of their ideology against this religious faith, when in fact it was just maybe one guy in the organization looking to make a name for himself. So all by himself, without the awareness or the approval of the group elders, he went and bombed this church. It appears as though he was, engaging in the ideology of the terrorist group, when in fact it really wasn't the ideology. It was about personal advancement within the group. The failure to recognize questionable assumptions. As human beings, we rely on heuristics, okay, which are sort of cognitive maps, mental maps, which often, take on the form of assumptions that, we assume if A, then B. However, not all assumptions are correct, and not all assumptions are created equally. Operating as though assumptions are correct will often lead to inaccurate conclusions. So a good example is, this perception, this assumption of what a drug mule looks like, right? That they have a certain look. Well, maybe for a period of time they did have a certain look, but you couldn't rely on that assumption, because then cartels started using middle-aged women, middle-aged soccer moms from middle-income economic statuses who looked wildly different from the traditional assumption of what a drug mule looked like. That will result, if we do that, if we rely on those incorrect assumptions, it's going to result in bad intelligence. Analysis of intelligence often happens better in groups than just relying on one person, right? When we get into groups, people have differing ideas. Maybe one person sees something that another person isn't seeing, or somebody else puts together two relationships that another person or another few people just can't put together. However, there's also some drawbacks to working collaboratively. The shortcoming to that is going to be groupthink, and that is when groupthink happens when, largely everybody in the group agrees, yeah, we think it's this, and maybe there's one or two people saying, yeah, but what about, maybe it's not that, what if it's this over here? And the bulk of the group, because they sort of are in agreement, sort of, I don't want to say gang up or bully the other person. I don't think that's the intention, but there's a majority rule. And so the people who are in the minority of that thought process feel overwhelmed and say, okay, I acquiesce, when in fact, maybe they're correct. Maybe we need to investigate their perspective further, dot our I's, cross all our T's before we dismiss it, rather than just relying on the most popular idea of the group. There are also bureaucratic barriers. So one is going to be information sharing. We've talked about this in previous chapters. There's a lot of branches to the intelligence community. They don't all play well together. Even the ones who play well together, they don't necessarily all have thorough methods of communication. Maybe some people in one agency don't know who it is in another agency that needs to know this information, and therefore it never gets there, right? So connecting all those dots from agency to agency and getting that intelligence into the hands of all the agents and the analysts that it needs to be in doesn't always happen. Some agencies, and this is actually really common in law enforcement in general, get very territorial about their information. They don't want to share it. They want to be the one to break the case. They want to be the one to break the intelligence and present the intelligence, and to have that air quotes win on their professional record and with their professional reputation, so they don't share. But we have to remember that the issue here is the safety of the United States, and that the intelligence community is huge, and they work better together than as isolated pieces. Another bureaucratic barrier is going to be truth decay, and that's going to be diminishing the role of factual information because it's replaced by opinion or agenda, like political agendas, which results in the decay of the truth from that information and that intelligence.